Thanks for joining. I'm Lucy Forbes, Principal Policy Manager at the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner.
And I'm Emma Dalco, Project and Policy Officer in the Business and Human Rights team.
This webinar is the first in a series that the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner is developing to support covered entities to implement their obligations to take reasonable steps to ensure that goods and services procured by and for New South Wales public entities are not the product of modern slavery. This session gives an overview of the obligations that apply to more than 450 public entities under New South Wales law and introduces the Commissioner's guidance on reasonable steps to manage modern slavery risks. This webinar is not legal advice, and you should seek individual advice about your entity's obligations under New South Wales law. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are Australia's First Nations, and this country always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening to this webinar. As we discuss modern slavery, it's particularly important to recognise that First Nations people in Australia have survived practices that we today would recognise as modern slavery and continue to live with its legacies. As I said earlier, this session will provide an introduction for public entities implementing their due diligence and reporting obligations under the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act. I'll begin by discussing what modern slavery is and the obligations the New South Wales Act imposes on New South Wales public entities. Emma will then talk about the framework of tools and guidance our office has developed for New South Wales public sector entities covered by the legislation. We'll also discuss what annual modern slavery reporting looks like for covered entities and how the Commissioner is approaching implementation and monitoring in line with his statutory functions. Finally, we'll talk about some of the training resources that are available to help covered entities learn more about managing modern slavery risk in their procurements. Future webinars will cover how to use the model tender and model contract clauses and managing supplier modern slavery performance. Modern slavery describes situations where offenders force, trick, or trap victims to exploit their labour and undermine their freedom. Simply put, it is when one person treats another as if they own them. Modern slavery doesn't occur in isolation. It arises where individuals or organisations exploit another person's vulnerability within an environment that fails to protect them. Modern slavery is an umbrella term which encompasses a number of criminal offences under New South Wales and federal law. These offences are set out in Schedule 2 of the Act and include slavery, servitude, forced labour, debt bondage, deceptive recruiting, forced marriage, human trafficking, organ trafficking, and the worst forms of child labour. For us in New South Wales, slavery can seem a fact of history or a long way away. But the reality is that it can occur everywhere, including here in New South Wales, and that it is deeply embedded in the global economy and in commercial incentive structures. Even in New South Wales, modern slavery is very difficult to identify and is often hidden in plain sight. Businesses and public entities in New South Wales can be connected to modern slavery through their supply chains, both local and overseas, and in some cases through their operations. The numbers on this slide provide some context for the risks that we're talking about. The International Labour Organization estimates that 50 million people worldwide are victims of one kind or another of modern slavery. The best available survey-based estimates indicate that approximately 16,400 people in New South Wales are victims of modern slavery. Modern slavery cases have economic costs for New South Wales, which are estimated at around $9.6 billion. This includes the cost of law enforcement activity, medical care for victim survivors, and productivity losses. It does not, of course, encompass the human cost to victims, many of whom never come forward. Victims and survivors may fear retaliation from their exploiters and may not make complaints or get help. Some may not realise that they're being exploited, and some may even blame themselves. In the last financial year, our support hotline, 1-800-FREEDOM, identified 533 people at risk of modern slavery and made 163 referrals for support and assistance. but it's estimated that between 80 to 98% of modern slavery cases in New South Wales go unreported. Efforts are ongoing across the New South Wales government to help change this. Almost 34,000 frontline workers in public entities have now received mandatory modern slavery training. And this leads us to the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act and related legislation, which came into force in 2022. This Act created the role of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, an independent statutory officer who reports to New South Wales Parliament. The Commissioner has a range of functions, which include providing support and assistance to victims, monitoring the effectiveness of New South Wales government action to address modern slavery, and advocating for and promoting action to combat modern slavery. Critically, the Act also creates mandatory reporting and due diligence obligations for certain New South Wales public entities, including government agencies, local councils, state-owned corporations, local Aboriginal land councils, and some universities. We'll refer to these entities in the webinar generally as covered entities. While the legislative provisions that impose obligations on different types of entities vary, in general, public entities must take reasonable steps to ensure that the goods and services they buy are not products of modern slavery and report annually on these steps. You should ensure that you're familiar with the legislation that covers your entity and seek legal advice on your obligations as required. Under the Government Sector Audit Act, government agencies are also subject to a modern slavery audit by the New South Wales Auditor General. The Auditor General has indicated that the Commissioner's guidance on reasonable steps, which Emma will talk to in a moment, is the auditable standard. It's really important to note that there's also a separate federal Modern Slavery Act in place, and this creates annual modern slavery reporting obligations for certain large commercial and not-for-profit entities in Australia. This session will only address obligations under the New South Wales Act. Again, you should carefully review your relevant legislative provisions to confirm your entity's obligations and seek legal advice if required. I'll now hand over to Emma to walk you through the Commissioner's Shared Implementation Framework.
Thanks, Lucy. To help support covered entities to understand how to meet reporting and due diligence expectations, the Commissioner developed a shared implementation framework, which includes 5 pillars, the 5 that you can see on the screen. The first of these is the guidance on reasonable steps, which we will refer to as the GRS in this webinar. The other pillars include our model tender clauses, model contract clauses, the inherent risk identification tool, also known as the IRIT, and the public register. Lucy and I will discuss all of these in this webinar. Please note that all resources and tools that we speak about are freely available to access and download via the Office's website. We're now going to take a deep dive into the GRS, the first of the 5 pillars that make up the Commissioner's Shared Implementation Framework. Please feel free to pause this webinar and scan the QR code on the screen now to access the GRS and follow along. The GRS is a comprehensive guidance document that covered entities should use to design their modern slavery risk management frameworks and respond to risks that arise in their procurements. The GRS explains fundamental concepts like forms and sources of connection to modern slavery risks, prioritizing risks to people, leveraging capability, and levels of due diligence. This webinar will discuss each of the reasonable steps from 1 to 7, as you can see on the screen. Each of these steps sets out specific guidance that covered entities should undertake at different points of the risk management cycle in their procurement and operational activities. The 7 reasonable steps are commit, plan, source, manage, remedy, report, and improve. For each reasonable step, the guidance provides practical advice on identifying and mitigating modern slavery risks in covered entities' operations and supply chains. Each reasonable step also includes examples of good practice and hallmarks of best practice, as well as tools and resources for further capability development. Each part also provides instructions on the information and data covered entities must collect to report annually on the reasonable steps they have taken. which corresponds with the questions asked in the GRS online annual reporting form. The link to that is also on our website. A core concept underpinning the GRS is the level of modern slavery due diligence a covered entity needs to do when undertaking a procurement. Due diligence is the ongoing risk management process to prevent, identify, mitigate, address, and account for actual or potential negative impacts in covered entities' operations and its businesses' relationships. Covered entities need to undertake due diligence throughout the procurement process to manage risk in its supply chains. These include steps at each part of the planned, source, manage cycle and beyond. The level of due diligence required for a particular procurement will, as shown in the matrix on the screen, depend on both the covered entity's capability level and the level of inherent modern slavery risk associated with the good or service that covered entity is procuring. The GRS provides information on how covered entities can determine their capability level. The IRIT, which we will talk about in a moment, sets out the risk level of various goods and services. If your procurement involves products at multiple GRS due diligence levels, you should always apply the highest due diligence level required for the contract as a whole. The key thing to remember is that if you are undertaking a high-risk procurement, heightened due diligence is required. This means two things. One, you need to use appropriate tender clauses to collect information about what your suppliers are doing to manage risks in their own supply chains. And two, you will also need to include more stringent contractual safeguards and monitor suppliers' performance across the life of the contract or the arrangement. I'm going to hand back to Lucy now.
Thanks, Emma. Tender clauses are a really important tool to help covered entities select suppliers that understand modern slavery risks in their supply chain and have the policies and processes in place to take reasonable steps to manage these risks. The New South Wales Supply Code of Conduct requires that suppliers take all reasonable steps to ensure that businesses within their supply chains are not supplying products of modern slavery. The New South Wales Procurement Board Direction, PBD 2025-05, requires that entities subject to the Public Works and Procurement Act use tender clauses substantially based on the Commissioner's heightened due diligence model tender clauses when undertaking high-risk procurements. This direction commenced on 1 January 2026, and New South Wales Government agencies must comply with this direction when undertaking a procurement that commences on 1 July 2026 or later. So the model tender clauses that our office has developed are based on a good practice model that's used by the UK government. We've developed two different versions of the model tender clause, a heightened version for high-risk procurements and a streamlined version for lower-risk procurements. These tender clauses are available via our website or at Appendix I in the GRS. Once a covered entity has selected a supplier, you'll need to ensure that you have contractual leverage in place so that modern slavery risks are managed properly throughout the life of the contract, and remediation is provided to people who've been exploited in connection with your entity's business activities. Like the model tender clauses, a heightened and a streamlined version of the contract clauses is provided in line with the risk level of the procurement. A core concept underlying the model contract clauses is shared responsibility. This requires moving away from the typical liability regime of representations and warranties, where the supplier warrants or guarantees that certain representations about their connection to modern slavery in their supply chain or their systems for addressing it are true and correct. Reps and warranties clauses give public buyers limited leverage over suppliers where they identify modern slavery. The only recourse is often termination, which may compound harm by putting vulnerable workers suddenly out of a job. Instead, the Commissioner's model contract clauses provide a foundation for buyers and suppliers to collaborate, to identify and address risks, monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of their efforts, and work together to support access to remedy for people who've been exploited in their supply chains. We come now to the Inherent Risk Identification Tool, or IRIT, which we've mentioned a few times already. This is a really important tool for people who are involved in procurement to understand which goods and services are or tend to be high risk for modern slavery. It's a simple to use risk database that we developed with support from the Institute of Transport and Logistics at the University of Sydney's Business School. And it provides our officers assessment of the global or overall modern slavery risk level of each good and service set out in the New South Wales Whole of Government or SPENCube taxonomy. The IRIT is a dynamic tool and it'll be updated and improved on an ongoing basis. It assigns one of 4 risk levels, high, moderate, low, or minor, to over 550 product categories and sets out the basis for each assessment. Risk scores are assessed by reference to the presence of 3 risk factors in the production and supply of product categories. 1, regulatory context. 2, the presence of vulnerable populations in the supply chain. And 3, supply chain models. One thing that's really, really key when using the IRIT is that in prioritizing your efforts to manage risk, covered entities should be thinking about where the biggest risks to people are in their supply chains, not prioritizing risk solely on the basis of the highest volume or highest value transactions. Covered entities should also remember that the IRIT is not a substitute for due diligence. It's a starting point. It tells you the kinds of products that tend to be high risk and helps you ask your suppliers the right questions. But it doesn't relieve your entity of its obligation to ask suppliers about how they're actually managing these risks in their own business and to properly evaluate their responses. If a product does have a high inherent risk of modern slavery, this doesn't mean that covered entities are restricted from procuring that product. However, it does mean that covered entities will need to undertake due diligence to choose lower risk suppliers and ensure their contracts enable them to work with those suppliers to manage and remediate risks during the contract. The newest update to our IRIT tool includes a linked GRS resource on modern slavery risks in construction. Different kinds of labour and different materials used in construction involve different levels of risk. For construction categories in the IRIT that involve a combination of labour and materials, so for example, building a school or building a road, the IRIT will list their risk level as further assessment in blue. Covered entities should use this resource here to select the specific types of construction labour and materials that they're using in this specific procurement. A covered entity's inherent risk level for this procurement will be the highest level of risk involved in those labour or materials categories. Our officers also created a how-to video that explains how to use and navigate version 2.0 of the IRIT. This should be a starting point for new users. It explains the purpose of the IRIT, the structure of the tool, and how to use it to assess the inherent risks of products and services that your entity procures. The Commissioner is required by the Act to maintain a register that lists non-compliant entities, including any other information or as well as any other information they deem appropriate. The public register that's currently published on the Commissioner's website contains schedules for public buyers who fail to comply with their due diligence and reporting obligations under the Act. Other schedules may be added by the Commissioner from time to time. And with that, I'll hand back to Emma to talk about reporting and implementation.
Thanks, Luce. Under the Act and related legislation, more than 450 New South Wales public entities have obligations to include details of their reasonable steps to manage modern slavery risks in their annual reporting information. Different legislation covers the publication of annual reporting information by different types of covered entities. Covered entities should carefully review their relevant legislative provisions to confirm their obligations, and as we've said before, please seek legal advice if required. Covered entities should report in 2 places. Firstly, in their formal annual report, and secondly, via the online GRS annual reporting form. Covered entities should complete and submit this form upon the publication of their annual report or no later than 45 days after its publication. The GRS includes details of the data you should collect and report on for each of those reasonable steps. Covered entities can also refer to the GRS resources listed on the slide and available also via our website for further guidance. The GRS came into effect on the 1st of January 2024. It does not formally apply to activities prior to that date, but may need to be taken into consideration. For example, in relation to procurement arrangements entered prior to that date, which have produced contracts whose execution remain ongoing. The GRS provides comprehensive guidance, and there is no expectation of immediate and complete implementation. Covered entities should prioritize 1, following the risk, prioritizing due diligence and risk management for transactions where there is a heightened risk to people of modern slavery. And 2, the areas that we have identified in the GRS as monitoring focus areas for the first few years of implementation. That is ICT, cleaning services, renewable energy and domestic agriculture, and this year, 2026, construction. These sectors have been selected due to high levels of modern slavery risk in both local and offshore supply chains. The Commissioner's functions include monitoring the effectiveness of legislation and governmental policies and action in combating modern slavery. In line with this, the Commissioner may make reports to the New South Wales Parliament from time to time on risks in particular supply chains. Covered entities should carefully review these reports, which may have implications for or provide further guidance on managing risks in particular supply chains. For example, this year in 2026, the Commissioner concluded a probe into the New South Wales Government's procurement of electric vehicles and related infrastructure, drawing attention in particular to risks associated in those supply chains and others, especially those including lithium-ion batteries. To help covered entities digest the comprehensive GRS, we've also developed supplementary resources and training modules that help break down covered entities' modern slavery due diligence and reporting obligations. Several GRS resources are available on our website. We have also collaborated with Capability in New South Wales Procurement to develop a series of short e-learning modules. These are available on the Compario platform, which is accessible to all public entities. There are 2 learning pathways on Compario. The first, titled Manage Modern Slavery Risks in Your Organization. This learning pathway is for senior management, legal, human resources, risk, and policy practitioners, and any others operating at a whole of organization level in covered entities that have due diligence and reporting obligations. The second, titled Manage Modern Slavery Risks in Procurement, is for procurement professionals in covered entities that also have due diligence and reporting obligations. The e-learning modules will be developed for each of the 7 reasonable steps. So, on behalf of Lucy and myself and the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, we want to thank you for watching this webinar. If you have any questions or feedback on this session, please feel free to reach out to us via the email address listed on the slide, grs@dcj.newsouthwales.gov.au. You can also sign up to the office's monthly newsletter using the QR code shown here on the screen.
Thanks again for everyone who's joined us in this webinar. Keep your eyes out for the next 2 sessions in this series, which will focus on using the model tender clauses and using the model contract clauses.
Thanks for listening.